Hello, and welcome to the CSJ's Beyond Westminster podcast, where we bring you real stories from across Britain's forgotten communities. Today we're diving headfirst into the ongoing election campaign, but with a unique twist. This time, we'll be hearing from the CSJ's own on what's driving politics. Our host today is the CSJ's fearless leader and chief executive, Andy Cook, who's joined by our top brass, including Ed Davies, CSJ Director of Policy, Sophia Warringer, CSJ Deputy Director of Policy, and Rhiann Heisman, our brilliant Director of Development. Together, we'll explore the crucial questions shaping this political moment. What does the election mean for the most disadvantaged in society? Did party manifestos deliver for the poorest? And what should the next government focus on in its first 100 days to deliver social justice? So, on today's exciting episode, we invite you to go beyond the sensational headlines, beyond the surface of the stories, and beyond Westminster.
Welcome, everyone. We have got this fantastic panel lined up with our Director of Policy and our Deputy Director of Policy, and a stand-in. Rhiann has joined as well due to Tim's absence.
Thanks so much for having me.
Right, Ed, what do you think? You're Policy Director, you're in government for 2 years, you advocate for the poorest in this country. What have all the parties offered? How do you feel about it all?
I don't think anything, Andy, I know. So actually, fresh off the press, we have just done our very own polling on low-income voters. We did this 5 years ago and said, what do you make of the major parties and their offerings? And what was really interesting is there was very, very little between them 5 years ago. The sort of vote levels were similar. The things they said were similar. And fast forward 5 years, a lot of it's the same. A lot of low-income voters don't feel they're listened to. They don't feel they're part of the conversation, except there was one massive difference in the polling. So, for example, things like, do the main political parties understand what it's like to struggle? Hasn't changed in 5 years. Exactly the same as 5 years ago. Parties only care about the rich. Labour and Conservative, different levels, but roughly the same as 5 years ago. But when we asked them, are the parties out of touch with you? The Conservative level was pretty similar, a bit higher than it was 5 years ago, but the Labour sample dropped by 18%. And that is reflected in a 14% rise in the Labour vote by low-income voters. So what we can say with certainty is that for some reason, something they are doing is speaking to their core constituency of low-income voters, and they are now seen as more in touch with them.
Sophia, that's interesting. I mean, you say at the CSJ that you go out and spend time listening to the poorest voters. It feels like Labour haven't said anything. So how on earth can they, the lowest kind of denomination in the country, saying that they get them a bit more?
I think this election is going to be fought as much on competence and trust than it is on policy. I think you're right. There's been a very sparse policy offering from all parties, really. Even the manifestos, the big, bold ideas they're supposed to be are kind of continuing more of what they could have done and a little bit funding more into individual pots. So I think the most disadvantaged across the nation are probably feeling quite disgruntled with the policy offer, but they've made their choice based on competency, on trust, and actually they voted for change. And the problem is that they keep voting for change and the change isn't delivered. So they voted for change for the most part in 2016 with the Brexit vote. They voted again in 2019 when they had a huge 80-seat Conservative majority. They feel they've got to go back to the polls and vote for change again because they're just not seeing the change that they want.
But so what are you saying, Ed, back to you on this, because you brought this bombshell of a poll. Policy doesn't matter then?
I'm not sure it doesn't matter, but it does make a difference that your policy speaks directly to the people who you want to vote for you.
But they haven't. We've just said that Labour haven't given any policy. Interestingly,
what that does mean is we can say that in 2019, what was being offered was not speaking to them. Remember, if we can rewind our brains to 2019, you had a completely different kind of election where you had Jeremy Corbyn, who was giving a very, very different view to the Conservatives, but it did not speak directly to this constituency. Interestingly, if you look at what Labour are offering, the reason it doesn't feel like they're offering much is there's actually not a huge deal between Labour and Conservative. It's been really interesting how they've held back on things like you would absolutely expect Labour to scrap the two-child limit. That is a core Labour welfare thing, and they're not going to. You would absolutely expect them to just push more welfare. Just this morning in their manifesto launch, actually they're really pulling back on the welfare stuff. They're saying actually work is important. They can see the economic inactivity figures. So actually, it doesn't feel like they say much. What they are saying is very similar to the Conservatives.
The Labour manifesto's just come out. We've just been flicking through it ourselves. One of the key things seems to be about banning energy drinks. Rhiannon, I'm going to you because you were never a fan of banning anything. What's your reflections on the manifesto and that in particular?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think one of their top priorities, in fact, their first priority is a growth agenda. Very interesting. I don't think you get growth if you ban a lot of stuff, personally. So I don't know. I think there's an interesting pro-business, pro-growth, pro-prosperity that Labour are really leaning into, which probably speaks to their desire to occupy and gain some of those voters more in the centre ground. I mean, banning energy drinks, I don't know, I haven't looked into the detail of that policy, but I can't imagine it will change much.
How do you feel? You work at the Centre for Social Justice. You're out there selling it all the time. What's this election give to you that you can say to the people that you're representing? Are you full of hope for what's coming from either party?
I'm full of hope that at some point maybe someone will get a handle to want to do some things and want to, I don't know, move and change. You know, there's been a lot around the problems, I guess, that we face as a country, especially post the pandemic. I think lockdown, obviously, as we talk about lots, poor petrol and the problems faced by the most disadvantaged. And I do think there are lots of promise in having a new cohort who might actually want to get some things done. But I don't think that this election has necessarily shown that to be the case. And I do think that a Labour majority come election day will, whatever happens, mask, you know, it will look like a big kind of Labour move to the left. I think it will mask an undercurrent of dissatisfaction that voters have in the political class and in their politicians, a dissatisfaction. I think that's probably, you know, the reform vote. There'll be this feeling of anti-politics, which I think a Labour majority could potentially mask some of that. And I don't think politicians should ignore it. I think they need to speak to it somehow.
It is that classic thing that the support at the moment for Labour feels a mile wide and an inch deep. And so they could win an absolutely stonking majority, but it's not a secure majority in the same way that the current 80-seat majority won at the last election was not a secure majority for the Conservatives, unless they speak to the core issues that people are talking about. OK, core issues. Sophia, you wrote, along with a co-pilot, Josh, one of the most profound reports of a generation, may I say, the Two Nations report of the CSJ. What are the big issues that you wish were being talked about in this election campaign?
You know, they're really actually not complicated. It's what people want. They want to walk down their street in safety. They want good education for their kids. They don't have high ambition for their kids. They just want them to have a job when they finish school or finish training, and they want to be able to see their GP, and they want to live in a community where they feel safe. Those asks are not high. It should not be hard for the government to deliver those simple things, but unfortunately it is. And that's why it's so frustrating that we at the Centre for Social Justice have so many ideas on how to tackle these problems, and yet the manifesto, the parties are not having the vision that is big enough to meet the scale of the need. And I think one of the ideas that the Two Nations identified is this idea of work and how that is approached, whether that is seen as worth it for people. And I think lots of both major parties have skirted around this issue. They see it as an issue. There's little tinkerings they can do to the welfare system, but there's not this like lift up your eyes and have a big vision for what work can be done. We've got those ideas here at the Centre for Social Justice. We know what they are. We're just willing for a government to take them up.
Talk to me about cost of living. This seems to be absolutely through everything in this election, yet no one's even raising this as a key issue. There's lots of bits and pieces, but what about cost of living in there? Is that not important here?
I think it is, and I know we've only seen a couple of big increases in our polling, but something that we've seen that's been a small increase was a 4 percentage point rise in both the Labour and the Reform vote of answering the question of this party cares about those on low incomes. It's a small percentage point rise, but it's significant. It was 3% for the Conservatives. I think the cost of living has therefore crystallised this problem as something that the policy offer needs to meet. And the cost of living obviously impacts everyone across all disadvantages and non-disadvantaged, but it's most acutely felt by those communities. And they don't have that buffer, whether that be a social buffer or a financial buffer of savings or a skills buffer where they can increase their work and increase their income. So it means that they are feeling the pinch. But it's also old news. And I think that's why the policy offer is not exciting on meeting the cost of living, because this has been something that's been trundling on now for a few years. And really, the politicians want to move on in the same way they wanted to move on from lockdown. They want to move on and get to the next thing. But the most disadvantaged communities, they're still not over it. They're still dealing with the consequences of it. I was out campaigning in a fairly kind of low income area of London just this week, and the amount of cut through about what actually matters to these voters is fascinating. So on doors, people were saying, I'm voting for Farage. Obviously, he's not standing in that seat. It was a London seat. They are very identified with him as a person. I think bringing in some of the American style politics of having a very presidential campaign that's coming over to the UK, and people are affiliating with people rather than policies. And unfortunately, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer don't have that kind of personal following that Farage does. And I think that's why people are moving towards him as seeing as a solution.
But they're not moving massively. All the polls suggest that Labour are going to absolutely trounce. So Farage has he cuts more into the Tory side, not into the Labour side. So in a sense, it hurts that side. So I guess what I'm interested in is, even on this poll, I'll go to you on this, Ed, does this even matter? Do our politicians care about the bottom 20%? We say, we give all of this, the Breadline Britain report, I'm sure everyone will read it with great gusto and great importance, but do our politicians read it and care? Because ultimately, do the bottom 20% vote?
I do think there is a big question of, have they really come up with the policies to attract the bottom 20%? I would say no, not really. If you look at the headlines that are coming out, and I'd be wary of reading everything through the media lens, but headlines coming out are about growth. Now, they would say, this is about, it's about growth, it's about raising their incomes. Likewise, the Conservatives would say there's stuff about taxes, is about reducing the burden of tax, so everyone gets more money and that's good and what have you. But that's not really what we hear about when we go out there. Like Sophia said, it's the nuts and bolts of, have I got a good school? Am I going to get a job? Can I see my GP? All these things. I think the other thing is, most of the policies we are seeing are about throwing water on a fire. They're not about stop lighting fires. So, you look particularly at some of the hospital GP stuff, things like that. Why are so many people pitching up at the GP at the moment with basic social problems, not clinical problems, but they are going in because they are isolated and lonely? What is the big picture out there that is driving this? What is going on with children's mental health? Like, the idea that we put a mental health nurse in every school is insane, because that doesn't stop a single child from having a mental health problem. So what is the building blocks of children's lives that has fundamentally changed in the last 20 years that is driving this? And so I think any government that's going to get serious about changing the UK needs to stop talking about how we're going to spend taxes, because the taxes are going to run out, and talk about how we actually build a society where these problems don't happen in the first place.
Rhiannon, do you think there is a problem that people want too much government?
Yes.
Okay, I'm moving on. Pray tell.
The Conservatives talk about it a lot, don't they? That people are better at spending their own money than government.
But the Conservatives haven't done that.
I totally agree.
And the lockdown measures and all of this. I guess what I'm trying to get to is listening to Ed there, that it feels like the population is looking to its government now for more than ever. And yet it kind of flatters to deceive. There's no promises it can make to kind of keep up with that demand. Do you think that's right? Is that what you hear on the doorstep when you're out there and visiting charities?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think certainly on the doorstep, but I also think, month on month, year on year here at the CSJ, when we're out on the front lines, we have an alliance of over 700 small grassroots charities who feed into every area of our policy work. And time again, we hear from them that it's people that change people. It's getting alongside someone in the messiness and the complexity of their life that actually makes the difference. And I just don't think that government can get to that level of localness and in people's lives. And, I think government...
But surely it can. So looking at the Labour manifesto, it's fascinating hearing some of the things. They've said things like dentist appointments they're going to go for. They're going to, interestingly, expand the number of prison population in order to try and rid some of the crime issues we're seeing. Big government things like that they feel like they're speaking to is what government can fix. And is it right that everything just feels a bit broken at the moment? Is that what comes through as well?
Yeah, I think so. And families feel broken, and communities feel broken, and high streets, and all these things. I just to me, lots of that just feels surface level, and it doesn't actually get into the messiness of people's lives and the potential that people have to make their own decisions and to release themselves from, their brokenness or whatever it is. So, I think, the Labour manifesto is full of it. I'm kind of looking over lots of it now, and it's all about even the banning the energy drinks, because people can't make the decision for themselves that it's unhealthy or whatever. It's constantly trying to control people's lives rather than releasing them to make good decisions for themselves.
Just on that point of people change people, what's really interesting about this is that I think we've sort of come to the point that we think service is the thing. So you see them talking about, we're going to build 14 new hospitals and we're going to build 20 new schools and what have you. And it's not that those things are bad in themselves, but there's no evidence that they make anything better. The thing where there's good evidence is that a good teacher can change a child's lives. It's like youth services. There's not really any great evidence that youth services are a good thing, but there's really good evidence that youth workers making relationships with children can really change their lives. And so it is this thing of, are the perfectly good, important, necessary things that the government can spend money on essentially white elephants, or do they enable some of those people change people relationships that really do make a difference to people on the ground? And I think we've got into a bit of a cycle of promising vast sums of money for services and white elephants that don't necessarily enable the relationships that really matter.
Sophia, you're an aspiring politician. You'll be leading the country this
I'm
one day.
absolutely not an aspiring politician.
How would you change things then? We're hearing that there's this absolute outcry from the public for our politicians to fix everything. We're hearing from the policy experts that is just simply not possible unless you go into a deeper sense of policy making. But that's not good electoral maths, is it? That's not going to win hearts and minds. What would you do about it?
It's a big question, Andy. I think
thinkers.
Something at the Centre for Social Justice that we're so passionate about is that the building blocks need to be right. And the building blocks of anyone's life is their family. That's their first social template of a relationship. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 40 years, let alone the last 14, is a decline in stable families. And I think that the government needs to do everything it can to help families to stay together, to have healthy relationships, and to particularly invest in the early years where all those social templates are learnt, and giving young people then the resilience that they need to move forward. We would do that in lots of ways. Simplify the tax system, roll out family hubs in every organisation, recognise the value of marriage both in the tax system and culturally. There's a host of policy solutions that we would put forward to make sure that those early building blocks are there. And that's just one of the issues that we look at. On addiction, we want more money into recovery services because we know that it's not good enough for people just to maintain their level of drug use. They need to be completely free of it so that they can work and have flourishing relationships. On every area of our work at the Centre for Social Justice, we have solutions, whether that be people on universal credit keeping more of the money that they earn so that work is worth it, so that things like 0-hour contracts are used flexibly and purposefully to enable people to move through the work system rather than trapping them in unstable places of employment.
But to go to your point of earlier, does any of that matter in a party's manifesto right now if they don't have someone who's connecting with the public? Farage seems to be connecting with a certain part of the public. Keir doesn't have to have any policy because it feels like the public's so fed up with everything that's gone before that he's winning throughout without connecting. Because even though these figures say that they've got a bit better, they're still pretty woeful on how people are feeling about politicians. So do any of those ideas that you've just said, all of which sound fantastic to me, do they matter if you don't have politicians that are espousing the values or pushing and selling them well?
Unfortunately, I think they don't have that much resonance because people vote on elections on how they feel, and a lot of how they feel is how they connect with the person who's asking them to vote for them, and that is a lot on personality and on vision. And I think what we're lacking in this country is a vision of how these policies, whether they be small or big, tie together and what the direction the nation is moving in. I think it's very hard to put into a sentence what Rishi Sunak stands for. It's hard really to put into a sentence what Keir Starmer stands for, apart from winning the election and, making that final leap into number 10. I think that's what people are missing out on. Actually, more people than ever are saying they're not going to vote. Less people are certain that they'll vote at all. And over half of those who said from our poll that they're not going to vote said the reason is that they're just not interested. They're voting with their feet, literally, by saying, well, I'm going to try and sort out my own life. Neither party is, setting me alight with a vision, so I'm just not going to make a choice between them.
Well, these seem like Sad times. Ed, you've been an advisor in government. You've advised some of the most senior, significant people going. What would your advice to them be now then?
I mean, there's an old saying about elections that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And one of the really interesting things at the moment is that I think they're campaigning in prose. I think actually some of the campaigns are quite boring and they're not giving a real vision for it. I think, as Sophia said, what is Sunakism? What does he stand for? I really couldn't tell you. And sort of the big question that keeps coming back to my mind with, I would say, probably the last 4 prime ministers is it's a really terrible job. Why do you want to be prime minister? And I don't think I could answer that about any of the last 4 prime ministers or any of the people currently standing. I think to a degree I could have said that about Cameron and big society. I could have said it about Blair and education, and things like that. But I look at the current lot and think, what is it? Why are you going through the hell of being a politician? What is it that is at the end of the rainbow? And we're missing that. And I do think that becomes really important. And I think if you don't have, I mean, the classic example was the sort of Barack Obama hope. Like he literally had posters saying hope, like this thing of the future. And if you don't have hope or something to aim for, what you get is fear. And that's exactly what we've seen in the States with Trump. And it's exactly what's creeping up now with Farage. And it's what we're seeing across Europe as well. If you don't offer someone a really great vision to rally around in the future, people will start to get disenfranchised and say, well, we can rally around something we're afraid of, maybe.
Speaking of being afraid, we're going to invite some audience questions now. So whoever wants to come to the front, speaking to the mic clearly, we're going to have some questions. We have our resident Geordie coming up. Mark.
Oh, hi. I was wondering, is everything about more money? We keep hearing about unfunded spends and neither party is raising taxes, yet commentators are quick to dismiss efficiency benefits. It sounds pretty bleak and the economic situation will be difficult for any government. But for the bottom 20%, is this a terrible sign that nothing can change? And what can government do? How can government approach social problems in the financial context?
Very good. Ed.
So I think this is probably the massive question. You mentioned that, the Labour Party aren't going to do some of the things like the 2-child limit you would absolutely expect them to do. I think they are aware that the financial context now is dire. And I don't think we can overstate that. It's far worse than it was after the financial crash. When I left the Department of Health, where I was an advisor recently, they were projecting a $6 billion overspend for this coming year. I understand that is now looking higher. So do not underestimate how bad the financial situation is. And in some ways, that's a real concern. It's how does a government govern when the finances are that bad and things aren't in a good state? But I think there's also an opportunity there to rethink how we do things, to understand that some things actually don't cost huge amounts of money. Sophia mentioned families there. Like, actually, stable families make money. Like, they don't cost anything. They're really important. You can go after that. You can build families. Employment there's always a good return on people being in work. They don't take welfare. They do pay taxes. It's good both ways. The education system is a good place to invest. Educated people earn more. So there are things you can do to really focus on to drive this. But the danger is you just keep making spending pledges that you can't fulfil and you lose people on the way.
So the Labour argument is that this is what the Tories have gone into. They keep making pledges, national service, rolling out these other... They're coming up with some of these big ideas that are perhaps unfunded. This used to be the attack line of the other way around, whereas Labour are basically saying we're going to keep it steady, we're going to grow the economy, anything we're going to make from taxing public schools or whatever, private schools, we're going to spend. That they've been criticised for being boring. I think Mark was pushing at is actually that a bit more of an honest politics than what we're seeing now from the Tories.
I think there's honesty with that. I think we need to be very clear about what is driving the demand. And no one is really talking about the demand. I think people very easily say, I want more money for my hospital, I want more money for my GP, etc. But why is there such a demand? I think it goes back to what we were saying about community cohesion, about family stability, about people looking to the state to answer their problems, and people going to services to answer what is a very basic human need of connection and not being lonely and having people that care and love you. And obviously the state can never answer that longing. So I think we need to have a question too about what is the individual's role in all of this? What is their responsibility, both to their family, their community and their neighbourhood and their nation, as well as also obviously talking about government's responsibility alongside.
Can I just follow up on that? So I think that's fascinating, really helpful. Do you think Nigel Farage is speaking into what is driving the demand? He is going big on that this is the immigration election. Whether you agree with it or not, he is suggesting that that is what's driving this demand. That's why there's no hospital places or dentist places. That's why you can't get your kid into school. That's why house prices are so high, whether that's right or wrong. It feels he's trying to suggest that that's the demand. Is that essentially what you're saying? We should be talking more on that level and having a debate there?
I think he's definitely trying to talk into that demand for sure. I think it's a campaign slogan for a more nuanced policy position. I think there is a very honest conversation needs to be had about the demand on housing. We talk a lot about housing supply, which is obviously a big issue, but the demand is a huge part, and immigration has driven a lot of that, as well as an aging population and, larger houses not being downsized to smaller houses, and also family breakdown, huge driver of rising demand. So that's one aspect of, yes, I think that is a conversation that needs to be had. Whether that can come across in that nuance on a campaign trail is a different question. But I think he's trying to lift people's eyes beyond just X more billion for the NHS, which is what we need to get away from. Our country is obsessed with funding that black hole. And yes, it's in a brilliant organisation. We can all point to people in our lives that probably wouldn't be here if the NHS didn't exist, but it doesn't mean it's perfect, and it doesn't mean it doesn't need reform.
Okay, I want some more questions. Anyone else like to step forward? Emily?
Ed, you mentioned youth worker relationships, GP relationships, etc. I hear this a lot in my research, that is what works. You say maybe a good teacher would work, but obviously the teachers will say they're strapped. So going back to prevention, how do you prevent a further rise in the mental ill health of our children and young people?
So it's sort of starting where you ended there on children at school. I mean, there was some really interesting research published last week from the Institute of Fiscal Studies that looked at the gap between deprived children and the rest of their cohort over the last 20 years and through their educational career. And slightly depressingly, what it says is that when a child starts at school age 5, the distance between deprived child and sort of the average is pretty much the same as it was 20 years ago, and pretty much remains exactly the same the whole way through school. And what that speaks to for me is not schools, it speaks to those first 5 years. It speaks to that early intervention. It's if you don't get it right there, then the tone is set. And it's the Jewish proverb, isn't it? Give me a child of 7 or whatever it is, and I'll give you the man. That actually this stuff is set. Not there's stuff you can do, but actually a lot of it is really early in life, and that focus on early intervention becomes really important. And within that, it is about the family, it is about the home context, it is about stability. You get right back to really core nurturing themes like attachment. Like, is a child attached to its parents? Do they have a nurturing environment? Is it a peaceful, calm environment? What does that look like? And actually, I think an awful lot of what we do in government is just trying to put together the pieces of what we haven't got right in that early few years.
Okay, but that's great and fine and long-term thinking. We're hearing that we want more of that. But as our question just said, there's an emergency right here, right now. Sophia, you did your Two Nations report that brought this out starkly. There's an emergency now. Totally agree, longer-term fix. What do we do right now for our young people who are hurting, crying out for more support? What do we do with it?
I think we need to have a better triage system, so we are sifting out those who are really in crisis from those who are feeling the ups and downs of life and potentially using medical labels to describe that experience. I think we will need to increase capacity for GPs because they are the ones that people go to, whether you like it or not, but we need to increase the toolbox that they can use. So instead of only looking at medical solutions, of course they are very important, we need to look at the social context, which is often driving the mental health struggles that people face. And we've talked about social prescribers here at the Centre for Social Justice. They happen in some places across the UK. We need them to be everywhere, but we need them to not be uber professional. This is about building relationships with people where people go into community groups where they can be cared for and cared about rather than going just to another professional. So that was something we want to see everywhere.
Rhian, as part of this, would you ban social media for under 16s? Or under 18s or whatever the hell they were talking about?
I don't really know what that policy means. Banning social. I just don't know how you do that. How, what? So we ban mobile phones in schools. That's already happened, and it's clearly not working because the mental health crisis is getting worse. It feels like actually the issue is probably more at night when kids are going to sleep and they have these phones and it's keeping them up and it's keeping them comparing. It's like when I was at school, which was not that long ago, you left school at school. You could go home and just like collapse on the sofa and watch Friends with your brothers, and it wasn't like everything was with you in your face the whole time, whereas it feels like teenagers now just have it constantly, that burden. That doesn't feel right, but it probably, I don't know I don't know how you can possibly go about banning social media, because that would involve having age verification on the World Wide Web, and that feels very not good to me. But surely it's more about maybe empowering parents to, I don't know, look after their children at night and take phones away, but I don't know, that just feels like a much bigger cultural problem than just a quick fix of banning social media. It doesn't make sense.
Would you ban them?
So, well, I just want to come back a bit.
Don't you dodge it. Would you ban them, Ed?
Ban mobile phones
or social media?
No.
There you go.
But I think there is some of the questions underpinning this are really big international questions of morality that people won't quite say but have changed fundamentally in 20 years. So actually the reason that we're scared of children having mobile phones and social media is because there are beheading videos and hardcore pornography and suicidal ideation in their hands. That shouldn't be in adults' hands either. Like, why would we want that? And at some point I think adults have to say, yeah, I have my rights to all this stuff, whatever. But I've got a responsibility to young people to say, do you know what? I can probably live without beheading videos. It's probably not a right I need. I'm willing to give that up so that this 4-year-old doesn't stumble across hardcore pornography or something. And I think some of those really difficult big questions that we're not willing to have, and we're not willing to restrain ourselves, means we're coming up with these really weird little tactical things, like we're going to sort of ban TikTok for 13-year-olds but not 16-year-olds. And it won't work, and it can't really be rolled out globally. But it's because we're not really willing to have big cultural, moral questions.
I do wonder if the tide is slightly turning on this. Like, teenagers I know have kind of see the impact that it's had. They're not, stupid. They can see that it has not worked. And I think making decisions for themselves, often teenagers I ask, they say, oh, I wouldn't give my child social media now. And that just, I don't know, I wonder if it's interesting if there might be a bit of a turning naturally against it, because we've increased awareness about it. It's more that we as adults have failed to adult in this area.
Oh, absolutely. But I think it's also, I remember at age about, so in the late 90s, a friend of mine got what was called a snuff video. It was basically a gang fight where someone got killed, and it was absolutely seen by the whole of society as something you should never ever watch. Parents, children, everyone. Now, well, we share them on TikTok. They're a bit of fun. And that's not about children, that's about parents, that's about adults, that's about us saying, do you know what, it's just not appropriate to watch someone get killed. And I don't know how that's changed in 20 years so quickly.
Time for one last question.
Looking ahead over the next few weeks, a lot of people expect a lot of change from whatever shape the next government takes. What changes do you think we should expect in the first 100 days of the new government?
Okay, we're going to finish with this. We're going to go down the line. What are you expecting? First 100 days of a new government, could be either side. Let's just say it'll be Labour, just for as a slight prediction. What's going to happen in the first 100 days?
I think they're going to do a lot of big thinking. I don't think they're going to do so much
no doing
policy announcements in the detail. I think they're going to do something on housing planning. I think they'll do something on their education vision. I think they'll do something on the NHS. I don't know what it will be. It'll be more funding for sure. It won't be doing the root causes that we've talked about, but I think we'll see that. And then they'll have their plan for immigration, whatever that is.
So you think there'll be a plan on immigration? There'll be more money in the NHS. The budget will be in October or November, and they'll do some thinking on education and housing.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 thoughts and 2 do's. Ed?
Years ago, I interviewed all the health secretaries going back to the 1980s, and one of them was Frank Dobson. And Dobbo, and it was one of the most foul-mouthed interviews I've ever done, which was great fun. Him, not me, I'd add. And during this process, said, when you get into Department of Health, what is the first thing you should do? And he said, do absolutely nothing. Whatever you've been told up to that point, don't take it for granted. Whatever you think the numbers are, don't take them for granted. Give yourself a month, get your feet under the desk, have a look at what is actually going on, and then come up with a decision. Now, you waste a fair amount of time doing that, but I suspect we're not going to see a huge number of things happen quickly, because when they get their feet under the desk, they will see the numbers are not good right now, and the answers are not easy.
Yeah.
Maybe on the other side, obviously there'll probably be a Conservative leadership election, won't there? And I did read or hear that someone was saying if Nigel Farage gets elected, there could be something very interesting in him potentially standing for the Conservative leadership election with the support of people like Liz Truss and Priti Patel. So you can keep an eye out for that.
Heard it here first, folks. Thank you. Oh, I've got a list here. Thank you to my panel, fantastic panel of today. We had Ed Davies, Sophia Warringer, and Rhian Heisman. Thank you for the live audience. Absolutely fantastic questions and great attentiveness. And thank you to the listeners. Tune in again soon.
If you'd like to hear more, subscribe to our channel for more interesting content like this, and follow us on Twitter @CSJ Think Tank for more updates.